In the early 1920s, the map of the world had been largely filled in, and the heroic, highly publicized race to the North and South Poles was effectively over. Yet, the deep Arctic still held vast, unclaimed, and highly contested territories that obsessed the minds of ambitious men. One of these men was Vilhjalmur Stefansson, a renowned and highly controversial Canadian Arctic explorer. Stefansson had developed a grand, radical theory that he called the Friendly Arctic, aggressively arguing that the polar north was not a barren, freezing wasteland, but a hospitable environment where civilized men could easily live off the land. To prove his theory and to secure a strategic foothold in the Arctic Ocean, Stefansson set his sights on Wrangel Island. Wrangel Island was a desolate, freezing, and entirely uninhabited rock located 100 miles north of the Siberian coast in the Chukchi Sea. Stefansson wanted to colonize the island and officially claim it for the British Empire or Canada, preemptively snatching it away from the newly formed Bolshevik government of Russia. To execute this audacious plan, Stefansson did not go himself. Instead, in 1921, he recruited 4 young, eager men who were desperate for adventure and polar glory. The expedition was led by Alan Crawford, a 20-year-old Canadian who was still a university student. He was accompanied by Fred Maurer, a 28-year-old American who had actually survived a previous disastrous shipwreck on Wrangel Island years earlier. The other 2 men were Lorne Knight, a rugged 28-year-old American with some polar experience, and Milton Gow, a 19-year-old American who simply wanted to escape his mundane life. They were young, strong, and completely intoxicated by Stefansson's promise that surviving in the Arctic would be a grand, easy adventure. But the 4 men needed someone to manage their camp. Specifically, they needed a seamstress to sew, repair, and maintain the heavy, tailored animal skin clothing that was absolutely vital for surviving an Arctic winter. Stefansson traveled to the frontier town of Nome, Alaska, looking to hire local, English-speaking Iñupiaq families to join the expedition. It was there that the young explorers crossed paths with a 23-year-old woman named Ada Blackjack. Ada Blackjack's life had been defined by profound hardship and quiet endurance, long before she ever heard of Wrangel Island. Born in a remote native settlement in Alaska, she had been raised in the town of Nome by Methodist missionaries. Because she was raised in the town, she had been taught to read, write, and cook Western food, but she had never been taught the traditional Iñupiaq survival skills. She was deeply afraid of polar bears. She did not know how to build a shelter. She did not know how to set a trap, and she had never fired a rifle in her life. At the age of 16, she had married a local dog musher, but the marriage had been a disaster. He physically abused her, eventually abandoned her, and left her entirely destitute. 2 of her 3 children had died in infancy. Her only surviving child, a young boy named Bennett, suffered from severe, crippling tuberculosis. Because she was absolutely penniless, Ada was forced to make the agonizing decision to place Bennett in a local orphanage, unable to afford the expensive medical treatment he desperately needed to stay alive. When Stefansson's men offered her a contract to join the Wrangel Island expedition as a seamstress, the promised salary was $50 a month. In 1921, to a destitute, desperate single mother, that was a staggering fortune. It was more than enough money to pay for Bennett's tuberculosis treatment, buy him warm clothes, and finally bring him home. Ada agreed to go, but only under the strict condition that she would be one of several native Alaskan families making the trip. She was incredibly shy and terrified of being the only woman on an island with 4 white men. The expedition launched on September 9, 1921. When Ada boarded the transport ship, the Silver Wave, she realized with sinking horror that she had been severely misled. The other native families who had promised to join the expedition had backed out at the very last minute, citing deep misgivings about the safety of the mission. Ada was entirely alone. She was the only woman, the only Alaska native, and the only mother on a ship full of ambitious, overconfident young men. The only other companion she had was the expedition's mascot, a tiny black and white kitten named Victoria, or Vic for short, who had been gifted to the crew by the ship's captain as a good luck charm. Despite her profound fear, Ada stayed on the boat. The image of her sick son in the orphanage anchored her resolve. When the silver wave dropped the small team on the rocky, barren beach of Wrangel Island on September 15, 1921, the ship sailed away, leaving them completely isolated from the rest of human civilization. Their contract stipulated they would stay for exactly 1 year, at which point Stephenson would send a relief ship to retrieve them. For the first few months, the friendly Arctic theory appeared to be remarkably accurate. The 5 colonists built a sturdy, comfortable camp out of driftwood and heavy canvas tents. The young men successfully hunted migrating seals, shot polar bears, and trapped Arctic foxes. Ada stayed inside the warm tent, diligently sewing their heavy fur parkas, cooking meals, and quietly playing with the kitten. As the long, dark Arctic winter passed, their spirits remained high, their bellies full, and their confidence absolute. When the summer of 1922 finally arrived, the crew eagerly scanned the southern horizon, waiting for the thick sea ice to break apart and clear a path for the relief ship, the Teddy Bear. But the Arctic is entirely indifferent to the schedules and assumptions of human beings. That summer, the global weather patterns shifted. The temperatures remained abnormally freezing, and the massive, grinding pack ice surrounding Wrangel Island simply never melted. It formed a solid, impenetrable, frozen wall that stretched for hundreds of miles. In August of 1922, the Teddy Bear tried desperately to bash its way through to the island to save the colonists, but the ice was too thick. The ship was forced to turn around and return to Alaska. The 5 people on Wrangel Island watched the brief summer fade into autumn, realizing with creeping terror that they were trapped. They would have to survive a second, unplanned winter in the deep Arctic. The second winter was a completely different reality. They had only brought enough provisions for 1 year, assuming they could easily live off the land if necessary. But as the dark, freezing months of late 1922 closed in, the game vanished. The seals migrated away, the polar bears disappeared, and the fox traps remained empty. The daily rations of hardtack, sugar, and flour were severely reduced, and then finally exhausted entirely. The camp was plunged into starvation. As the malnutrition set in, the physical and psychological toll began to break the men. Lorne Knight, the most experienced hunter in the group, fell violently ill. His teeth began to loosen, his gums bled profusely, and his joints swelled with agonizing pain. He had developed severe, crippling scurvy. By January of 1923, the situation had deteriorated into a desperate crisis. The crew knew that if they simply sat in the tents, they would all slowly starve to death. Alan Crawford, Fred Maurer, and Milton Gale made an incredibly dangerous, last-ditch decision. They packed a heavy sled with the last remnants of the dog food and supplies, intending to walk across the shifting, treacherous pack ice of the Chukchi Sea to reach the coast of Siberia, a grueling journey of roughly 700 miles to get help. On January 28, 1923, the 3 young men walked out onto the frozen ocean and disappeared into the blinding white horizon. They were never seen or heard from again. It is believed that they fell through thin ice or starved to death in the frozen wasteland. Ada Blackjack was now left completely alone at the camp to care for the dying Lorne Knight. The situation was a bitter irony. The rugged, highly confident male explorer was completely bedridden and helpless, while the small, timid seamstress who had zero wilderness survival skills was suddenly the sole provider for the camp. Ada had no choice but to learn how to keep them alive. She strapped on heavy snowshoes and stepped out into the howling sub-zero wind. Using pure trial and error, and driven entirely by the desperate need to eventually see her son again, she taught herself to survive. She learned how to set and bait heavy steel fox traps. She hauled freezing driftwood for miles across the beach to keep the small iron stove burning. Most incredibly, she forced herself to overcome her deep, paralyzing fear of the men's heavy hunting rifles. She taught herself how to load, aim, and fire the guns, eventually becoming proficient enough to shoot the occasional bird or seal that appeared near the ice. Despite her heroic efforts, Lorne Knight's physical condition continued to decline. As the scurvy slowly destroyed his body, the psychological agony of his impending death turned him bitter and cruel. From his sleeping bag, he verbally abused Ada constantly, accusing her of not hunting hard enough, blaming her for his sickness, and screaming at her when the fire burned too low. Ada endured the torment in silence. She continued to chop wood, empty his bedpan, and feed him whatever scraps of meat she could manage to shoot. Finally, on June 23, 1923, after months of suffering, Lorne Knight died in his sleeping bag. Ada Blackjack was now entirely alone on a frozen rock at the top of the world. Her only living companion was the cat, Vic. The psychological weight of total human isolation is enough to destroy the minds of trained soldiers, but Ada refused to surrender. She knew that if she died on the island, there would be no one left to pay for Bennett's medical care, and her son would die alone in an orphanage. Because Ada was physically exhausted and suffering from the early stages of scurvy herself, she was too weak to drag Lorne Knight's body out of the tent to bury him in the frozen earth. Instead, she stacked heavy wooden supply boxes around his corpse to protect it from scavenging animals, leaving him in his bedroll. She then moved into a smaller, separate storage tent and fortified it. Her resourcefulness in those final months bordered on the miraculous. Recognizing that her greatest threat was the massive polar bears that frequently stalked the camp, she gathered driftwood and heavy canvas and constructed a raised, sturdy observation platform so she could safely spot the predators from a distance. She gathered pieces of animal skin, scrap canvas, and wood, and built a brand-new functional boat to replace the expedition's original vessel that had been shattered in a winter storm. Inside her tent, she crafted a custom gun rack directly above her sleeping bag, allowing her to instantly grab her rifle if a bear tore through the canvas in the middle of the night. To ward off the creeping despair of total isolation, Ada found a heavy mechanical typewriter that had been left behind by one of the dead explorers. She sat in the freezing tent, her fingers cracked and bleeding from the cold, and painstakingly typed out her daily diary. She recorded the wind patterns, her hunting successes, and her deepest fears. She documented Knight's death, ensuring the world would know she had done everything in her power to save him. She wrote endless, heartbreaking letters to her son, promising him that she was coming home. For 2 agonizing months, she survived the deep Arctic entirely on her own terms. She practiced her marksmanship, repaired her boots, and waited for the horizon to change. On the morning of August 20th, 1923, Ada was awakened by a strange, unnatural noise cutting through the heavy fog. She grabbed her rifle, rushed out of her tent, and looked toward the ocean. There, breaking through the gray mist, was the towering wooden mast of a schooner. It was the Donaldson, a rescue ship finally breaking through the summer ice. Ada dropped her rifle and ran down to the rocky beach. The crew of the Donaldson lowered a small rowboat and navigated through the surf, fully expecting to find a camp full of hardened male explorers who had casually conquered the Arctic. When the rowboat hit the beach, Harold Noyce stepped out and stopped in shock. Standing before him was a tiny Iñupiaq woman, wrapped in a beautiful, meticulously sewn reindeer skin jacket she had crafted herself. She was smiling softly, holding the expedition's cat, Vic, in her arms. Noyce asked her where the other men were. Ada simply looked at the rescue ship and replied that she was the only one left. When the Donaldson returned to the United States, the story of Ada Blackjack became an international sensation. The press dubbed her the female Robinson Crusoe, marveling at the brutal irony of the expedition. The 4 strong, confident, highly educated men who had set out to conquer the Arctic for the glory of empire had all perished. The only person to conquer the island was the small, terrified, untrained seamstress who had only gone to the Arctic because she loved her child. However, the aftermath of her survival was tragically exploitative. Vilhjalmur Stephenson and Harold Noyce capitalized heavily on her story, writing profitable accounts and building public attention around the doomed expedition. Ada, the woman who had actually lived the nightmare, saw very little of the money generated by her own survival. The public quickly forgot her, and she retreated from the glare of the media spotlight, completely uninterested in fame or historical glory. She used the modest wages she had earned from the expedition to fulfill the single goal that had kept her alive on the ice. She paid the hospital bills for her son, Bennett. He received proper tuberculosis treatment, recovered from the disease, and Ada was finally able to bring him home. Ada Blackjack lived a quiet, deeply private life in Alaska, eventually passing away in 1983 at the age of 85. She never sought to be recognized as an explorer, and she never returned to the Arctic ice. But her name remains permanently etched into the history of human survival. The story of the doomed Wrangel Island expedition is a haunting testament to the brutality of the natural world, and it serves as a reminder that the most powerful force on Earth is not the ambition of empires or the arrogance of explorers, but the desperate love of a mother fighting to save her child.